Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to my channel. Your support is very important to me, so please subscribe to follow more cases and encourage us. Click the like button and let's get into the case. The wind carried a briny chill across the deck of the Northern Star as Captain Mike Reeves braced himself against the railing. Dawn had barely broken, the first hints of orange peeking over the eastern horizon as the commercial fishing vessel cut through the choppy Pacific waters. 22 miles offshore from San Francisco, the jagged silhouettes of the Farallon Islands loomed in the distance, shrouded in the morning mist that typically clung to this stretch of the California coast. "How are we looking, Steve?" Mike called out to his first mate, a stocky man of 42 who had been with him for nearly a decade now. Stephen Walsh wiped salt spray from his weathered face and gave a thumbs up. "Water temp's perfect. Current bringing in all sorts of life. Should be a good haul today, Cap." Mike nodded in approval. The Northern Star, a 65-foot stern trawler, had been his livelihood for 15 years. The vessel wasn't new by any means. Patches of rust spotted her hull, and some of the equipment had seen better days. But she was reliable, and in the competitive world of commercial fishing, reliability counted for more than aesthetics. The five-man crew moved with practiced efficiency as they prepared to deploy the nets. Besides Mike and Steve, there was Ray Martinez, the youngest at 28, a former Coast Guard technician with an easy smile, Dave Holloway, 36, quiet and methodical, and Pete Guthrie, 51, who had been fishing these waters longer than anyone else aboard. Each man knew his role, a well-oiled machine born from countless voyages together. "Weather report says we've got clear skies all day," Ray announced, checking the marine radio. "But there's a system moving in overnight. Might want to be heading back by late afternoon," Mike acknowledged with a grunt. They'd been out for 3 days already on what was supposed to be a 5-day trip for salmon and albacore tuna, but if they could get a good haul today, they could head back early and still make it worthwhile. Fish prices were up at the Fisherman's wharf markets, and the sooner they returned with fresh catch, the better. The sun climbed higher as they approached the islands, a cluster of steep, rocky outcrops that served as a sanctuary for seabirds and sea lions, and consequently a feeding ground for marine predators. The waters around the Farallones were notorious for their great white shark population, especially during late summer and fall, when the massive predators came to feed on the abundant pinniped colonies. "Let's stay north of Sugarloaf," Mike directed, referring to the largest of the islands. "Ray, mark that spot where we did well last month." Ray adjusted their course slightly, the boat's GPS system beeping as he set new coordinates. "On it, Cap, should be there in 20 minutes. Steve was on the starboard side, inspecting the winch system that would deploy and retrieve their trawl nets. He ran his hands along the thick cable, checking for frays or weak spots. Safety was a priority. At sea, a mechanical failure could quickly become catastrophic. "How's that wire looking, Steve?" Dave called over while preparing the net. "Some wear, but nothing major," Steve replied. "I'll grease these bearings before we deploy. They're stiffer than I'd like." He moved to the toolbox near the cabin, retrieving a grease gun and protective gloves. The morning air was crisp against his skin as he returned to the winch, applying lubricant to the moving parts with practiced precision. 15 years in commercial fishing had taught Steve to respect both the machinery and the ocean. Both could be unforgiving of mistakes. As Steve worked, he mentally catalogued the tasks ahead: deploy the nets, trawl for several hours, haul in, sort the catch, ice everything down, maybe redeploy if the first haul was good. It was a rhythm as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, a cycle repeated thousands of times over his career. Unlike some who grew restless with the repetition, Steve found comfort in it, a predictable structure in an unpredictable environment. Below the surface, the marine ecosystem pulsed with life, unaware of the human activity above. The Farallon Islands Marine Sanctuary was a biological hotspot, its productive waters supporting everything from microscopic plankton to 30-ton whales. In this intricate food web, sharks, particularly great whites, stood as apex predators. 20 miles to the southwest, a 16-foot female great white shark cruised through the deep water. At approximately 2,500 pounds, she was neither the largest nor oldest of her kind in these waters, but at an estimated 12 years old, she was in her prime. Her grey-blue dorsal surface allowed her to blend with the depths when viewed from above, while her white underbelly helped her disappear against the bright surface when seen from below. Perfect adaptive camouflage for an ambush predator. Scientists who studied the local population might have recognized her from her distinctive dorsal fin, which bore a small notch near the tip, likely from an encounter with a boat propeller years earlier. They had designated her SF-37 in their catalogue of identified great whites in the sanctuary, though the fishermen who occasionally glimpsed her knew nothing of such classifications. The shark had been patrolling these waters for the past week, drawn by the abundance of prey around the islands. Her primary targets were elephant seals and sea lions, whose blubber provided the high-energy food she needed. In the last few days, she had successfully ambushed a juvenile elephant seal, the rich caloric content sustaining her for several days. Now she was on the move again, her lateral line sensory system detecting subtle changes in the water that might indicate prey. Aboard the Northern Star, the crew was finishing preparations for the first net deployment. Mike stood at the helm, maneuvering the vessel into position while keeping an eye on the depth finder and fish finder displays. Scattered readings indicated schools of smaller fish in the area, a promising sign. "We're good to go when you are, Cap," Pete called from the stern deck, where he and Dave had finished preparing the massive net. "All right, let's get it in the A." "Water," Mike replied, reducing the engine speed to a steady crawl. "Steve, you okay with that winch?" Steve gave a thumbs up, wiping grease from his hands. "All set, should run smooth now." Ray joined the others at the stern as they prepared to deploy the net. The process required coordination. One wrong move could lead to tangled lines or worse, someone getting caught in the netting as it unfurled into the sea. They had done this countless times, but complacency was the enemy of safety on a fishing vessel. Steve positioned himself at the controls for the hydraulic system that would lower the trawl doors, heavy metal plates that helped keep the mouth of the net open as it was dragged through the water. As Pete and Dave began feeding the net over the stern roller, Steve engaged the hydraulics, the machinery humming to life beneath his hands. The deployment proceeded smoothly, hundreds of feet of netting disappearing into the water as the boat continued its slow forward motion. Once the net was fully deployed, Steve locked the winch and stepped back, satisfied with the operation. "Looks good," he called to Mike. "Net's properly deployed." Mike nodded, increasing the engine power slightly to maintain the optimal trawling speed. The Northern Star would now drag the net for several hours, collecting whatever swam into its path. It was a method that had changed little in decades, despite advances in technology elsewhere on the vessel. The morning progressed without incident. The men took turns at various tasks, some monitoring the equipment, others preparing the hold for the anticipated catch, and one always keeping an eye on the surrounding waters. They ate a quick lunch of sandwiches and coffee, conversation minimal as they focused on their work. By early afternoon, Mike decided it was time to retrieve the first haul. "Let's bring her in, see what we've got," he announced, beginning to reduce speed. Steve returned to the winch controls, while Ray and Pete prepared to guide the net back aboard. Dave stood ready with the sorting equipment, large plastic bins positioned to receive different species. As the winch began to turn, gradually retrieving the heavy cable, Steve noticed the hydraulic system seemed to be laboring more than usual. "Something's not right with this winch," he muttered, adjusting the controls. The machinery groaned in protest, the cable tensing as it strained against whatever was causing the resistance. "You think we're snagged on something?" Ray asked, peering over the stern. "Could be," Steve replied, easing back on the controls. "Or we've got one hell of a catch." Mike joined them at the stern, his brow furrowed with concern. "Want me to circle back? Give you some slack?" Steve considered for a moment. "Yeah, might help. But go slow. If there's a snag, I don't want to stress the cable too much." As Mike returned to the helm to maneuver the boat, Steve continued to monitor the winch. The hydraulic pressure gauge was reading higher than normal, but not dangerously so. Whatever was causing the resistance, it wasn't insurmountable. With the boat now turning in a wide arc, the tension on the cable eased slightly. Steve took the opportunity to inch more of the net in, the winch grinding steadily as feet of cable returned to the drum. After several tense minutes, the first of the trawl doors became visible beneath the surface. "I see something," Pete called out, leaning over the rail. "Looks like a good haul." As more of the net emerged, it became apparent that Pete was right. The bulging mesh suggested a substantial catch. The men's spirits lifted. A good first haul might mean they could head back to port earlier than planned. Steve maintained his focus on the winch, gradually increasing the retrieval speed now that the initial resistance had lessened. The machinery was still running hotter than he liked, but it seemed to be handling the load. With most of the cable now retrieved, he stepped closer to the stern to help guide the bulging net aboard. What happened next occurred so quickly that later no one could agree on the exact sequence of events. As the net broke the surface, swollen with thrashing fish, a particularly violent surge from the catch caused the boat to lurch. At the same moment, a wave struck the port side, tilting the deck sharply. Steve, who had moved closer to the rail to help with the net, lost his footing on the wet surface. His arms windmilled as he fought for balance. For a second it seemed he would recover, but then his boots slipped on a patch of fish slime, and his momentum carried him backward, over the rail, and into the churning water below. "Man overboard!" Ray shouted, already reaching for the life. "Ring! Steve's in the water!" Mike heard the shout from the helm and immediately cut the engine, rushing to the stern. "Where is he?" "There." Dave pointed to a spot about 20 feet behind the boat, where Steve had surfaced, sputtering and waving an arm. "I'm okay," Steve called, treading water. His foul weather gear made movement difficult, but he was a strong swimmer and remained calm. "Throw me a line." Pete had already grabbed the rescue line attached to the life ring. With practiced aim, he hurled it towards Steve, the bright orange float landing just a few feet from him. Steve began swimming toward it, making steady progress despite his waterlogged clothing. None of the men noticed the dark shape that had changed course upon detecting the commotion. SF-37, the female great white, had been cruising nearly half a mile away when her acute senses detected the unusual vibrations, the splashing, the irregular movement pattern so different from the familiar rhythm of pinnipeds. Curiosity, rather, than immediate hunger, altered her path. Steve had just reached the life ring, his fingers closing around the rope, when Ray shouted, "Something in the water, 9 o'clock." Mike saw it immediately, the telltale dorsal fin cutting through the surface about 50 yards away, moving with deliberate purpose toward the disturbance. "Shark!" he bellowed. "Pull him in now!" A surge of adrenaline shot through the crew. Pete and Dave seized the rescue line, pulling with desperate strength, while Ray ran for the boat hook to help haul Steve aboard. Mike sprinted to the cabin, grabbing the flare gun they kept for emergencies. Steve, hearing the shouted warning, felt his blood turn to ice. He knew these waters, knew what swam in them. He kicked hard, helping to propel himself toward the boat as the others pulled on. The line. He was making good progress, now just 10 feet from the hull. The great white, meanwhile, had closed half the distance, her sensory organs now fully focused on the strange object in her territory. She couldn't identify it as one of her usual prey items, but the erratic movements and vibrations triggered her investigative instincts. She accelerated slightly, her powerful tail propelling her through the water with effortless speed. "Faster," Mike ordered, loading a flare into the gun. "Get him up." Pete and Dave hauled on the line with renewed urgency, muscles straining. Steve was now at the side of the boat, reaching up toward Ray's extended boat hook. His heart hammered in his chest, but he forced himself to move deliberately, knowing that panic would only worsen the situation. The shark was now just 30 yards away and closing rapidly. Mike took aim with the flare gun, waiting for the predator to surface again. When the dorsal fin reappeared, he fired, the bright red flare arcing over the water to splash down near the approaching shark. The sudden flash and sizzle of the flare caused the great white to veer momentarily, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it circled wider, its behavior shifting from direct approach to a more cautious assessment pattern. This bought precious seconds, but not a reprieve. Steve had managed to get one arm over the gunwale, with Ray and Dave now grasping his foul weather gear, pulling him upward. His legs still dangled in the water as the men strained to lift his... "Wait, I see it," Steve gasped, catching a glimpse of the massive grey form now circling back toward him. "It's coming back." Mike had reloaded the flare gun and fired a second shot, closer to the shark this time. Again, the predator changed course, but now it was displaying more typical pre-attack behavior, swimming in tightening circles, occasionally disappearing from view as it dipped below the surface. Steve was halfway out of the water now, his upper body on the deck, while Ray and Dave pulled at his arms and shoulders. His legs thrashed as he tried to help propel himself upward, each second stretching into an eternity. The great white made her move with the explosive speed characteristic of her species, One moment she was circling at a distance. The next, she surged forward in a burst of power, breaking the surface in a shower of white spray. Her massive jaws opened, revealing rows of serrated teeth as she targeted the movement in the water. Steve felt a sickening impact as the shark's snout collided with his right leg just below the knee. In the initial strike, it was the force, rather than the teeth, that caused the damage, a testing bite to determine if he was appropriate prey. Even so, the impact was devastating, the shark's cartilaginous snout acting like a battering ram against his tibia and fibula. A scream tore from Steve's throat, more from shock than immediate pain, as the endorphins flooded his system. "Pull me up!" he shrieked, now frantically scrambling to get his body out of the water. The crew responded with desperate strength, hauling him upward with such force that they all tumbled backward onto the deck as Steve cleared the railing. As they scrambled to their feet, Mike grabbed the gaff hook, a long pole with a sharp curved hook used for landing large fish, and stood at the rail, ready to defend against another attack. Below, the great white circled once more, assessing. The initial bite had yielded information. This was not her usual prey. The taste and texture were wrong, lacking the rich blubber of a seal. In most cases, great whites release human victims after the first bite for this very reason. But SF-37 was still in investigative mode, the thrashing and blood in the water keeping her interested. "Get him to the cabin," Mike ordered as Pete and Dave lifted Steve, who was now clutching his injured leg, blood seeping through his torn pants. Ray ran ahead to clear a path, while Mike remained at the rail watching the circling predator. As they carried Steve toward the cabin, the shark made another pass at the boat, this time bumping against the hull, another investigative behavior. The vessel rocked slightly with the impact, a chilling reminder of the creature's size and power. Inside the cramped cabin, they laid Steve on the small table that served as both dining area and emergency medical station. Ray quickly retrieved the first aid kit, while Pete used shears to cut away the torn pant leg, revealing the extent of the injury. "Jesus," Dave whispered as the wound came into view. The impact had fractured Steve's lower leg, with a compound fracture of the tibia pushing through the skin. The surrounding tissue was badly bruised and torn, but remarkably, the arterial bleeding one might expect from a shark bite was absent, a testament to the fact that this had been an investigative bump rather than a predatory bite. "How bad?" Steve gasped, his face ashen with shock, unable to raise his head to see. "You'll keep the leg," Ray said grimly, already applying a pressure bandage to stem the bleeding. "But we need to get you to a hospital fast." Outside, Mike continued to watch the shark, which was now swimming in wider circles around the boat. He knew they needed to act quickly. Shock and blood loss were immediate concerns for Steve, and they were still hours from the mainland. Making a decision, Mike hurried back to the radio. He tuned to the emergency channel and pressed the transmit button. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is fishing vessel Northern Star, approximately 22 miles west of San Francisco, near the Farallon Islands. We have a crewman with severe injuries from a shark attack. Request immediate medical evacuation. Over." The radio crackled before a response came through. "This is U.S. Coast Guard Station Golden Gate. We copy your mayday. Please confirm your position and the nature of injuries. Over." Mike provided their GPS coordinates and a brief description of Steve's condition. Patient is conscious but in shock. Compound fracture of the right leg with moderate bleeding. Shark is still in the vicinity. We have applied first aid but need immediate evacuation. Over. Copy that, Northern Star. We're dispatching a helicopter with medical personnel. ETA approximately 30 minutes. Maintain your position if safe to do so and continue first aid measures. Monitor this channel for updates. Over. Will comply, Coast Guard. Standing by on this channel. Out. Mike returned to the cabin, where the others had stabilized Steve as best they could. They had elevated his injured leg, applied pressure bandages, and covered him with blankets to combat shock. Coast Guard sending a chopper, Mike informed them. 30 minutes out. How's he doing? Holding steady, Ray answered, checking Steve's pulse. But he's lost some blood and I'm worried about that bone. We've immobilized it as best we can. Steve was pale but conscious, his breathing rapid and shallow. "The shark?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Still out there, but keeping its distance now," Mike assured him. "Don't worry about that. Help is coming." For the next 25 minutes, the crew took turns monitoring Steve while maintaining watch for the shark. The great white continued to circle for a time, then gradually widened its pattern before finally disappearing from view, returning to the deeper waters from which it had come. Its curiosity satisfied, it resumed its hunt for more familiar prey. The distinctive thudding of helicopter rotors reached them before they spotted the aircraft, a Coast Guard MH-65 Dolphin search and rescue helicopter approaching from the east. Mike returned to the radio to guide them in, while Pete and Dave cleared the deck, securing loose equipment that might be affected by the helicopter's downdraft. The rescue operation proceeded with practiced efficiency. The helicopter hovered about 50 feet above the vessel, while a rescue swimmer was lowered to the deck. After a quick assessment, the swimmer coordinated with the crew to secure Steve in a basket stretcher, which was then hoisted into the helicopter. The entire procedure took less than 10 minutes. Before departing, the rescue swimmer handed Mike a form acknowledging the medical evacuation and provided instructions for the crew to contact the Coast Guard station upon returning to port for a full incident report. With a thumbs up from the deck crew, the swimmer was hoisted back aboard the helicopter, which then banked and headed eastward towards San Francisco. As the sound of the helicopter faded, an eerie quiet settled over the Northern Star. The men stood on the deck, the abandoned fishing nets and catch momentarily forgotten as they processed what had just happened. "Should we go back with him?" Dave finally asked, breaking the silence. Mike considered this. "Steve's in good hands now. Best thing we can do is secure the boat and head back to port in an orderly fashion. We'll meet him at the hospital." The others nodded in agreement. With renewed purpose, they turned their attention to the half-retrieved catch. The net was still partially in the water, loaded with fish. Under normal circumstances, they would have been jubilant at the size of the haul, but now they worked methodically, without their usual banter. Ray manned the winch, Steve's position, while Pete and Dave handled the net as it came aboard. Despite the interrupted retrieval, the catch was impressive. Several hundred pounds of salmon, albacore, and various ground fish. It would have been cause for celebration on any other day. As they sorted and iced the fish, Mike charted their course back to San Francisco. With good weather, they could be back at Fisherman's Wharf by late evening. He radioed ahead to the harbor master to inform them of their early return and the circumstances surrounding it. The journey back was subdued, each man lost in his own thoughts. They had all known the risks of their profession, the unpredictable weather, mechanical failures, the physical toll of the work, but a shark attack had never figured prominently in their calculations of danger. The Farallones were known for their great white population, but attacks on fishing vessels were exceedingly rare. As the California coastline came into view, Ray broke the contemplative silence. "You think he'll come back to fishing? After this?" The question hung in the air, none of them having a ready answer. Steve had been a fisherman his entire adult life, just as all of them had been. The sea was not just their livelihood, but their identity. "If I know Steve," Pete finally said, "he'll be asking when we're heading out again before he's even out of the hospital." The others smiled grimly at this, recognizing the truth in it. Commercial fishermen didn't abandon the life easily, no matter the hardships it presented. There was something about the rhythm of the sea, the independence of the work, that got into a person's blood. As they approached the harbor, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the water. The Golden Gate Bridge loomed ahead, its distinctive orange-red towers glowing in the fading light. Mike contacted the harbor master again for docking instructions, receiving confirmation that their usual berth was available. By the time they had secured the Northern Star to the dock, night had fallen fully. The crew worked efficiently to unload their catch into refrigerated containers for transport to the fish market in the morning. The shoreside workers who assisted them had already heard about the incident. News traveled fast along the waterfront and peppered them with questions that the crew deflected with terse responses, eager to complete their tasks and get to the hospital. With the boat secured and the catch properly stored, Mike declared their work done. "We'll deal with the paperwork tomorrow," he told them. "Let's go see how Steve's doing." They piled into Mike's pickup truck, still in their fishing gear, the scent of the sea clinging to them as they drove through the city toward San Francisco General Hospital. Upon arrival, they learned that Steve had been taken directly into surgery to repair his fractured leg. In the waiting room, they were met by Linda, Steve's wife of 15 years, a petite woman with prematurely gray hair and worry lines around her eyes. She had already been briefed by the medical staff, but wanted to hear the story from the crew directly. Mike provided a measured account, neither downplaying the danger nor sensationalizing it. The doctors say he was lucky, Linda informed them once Mike had finished. If it had been a full bite rather than just an impact, he might have lost the leg. As it is, they're placing pins to stabilize the bones. He'll need extensive physical therapy, but they expect a full recovery eventually. Relief washed over the men. Commercial fishing was physically demanding. A permanent disability would have ended Steve's career. A long recovery they could handle. They'd cover for him, make sure his share of the catch was set aside, look after his family needs. It was the unspoken code among them. It was nearly midnight when a surgeon emerged to inform them that the operation had been successful. He's in recovery now, the doctor explained. The fractures were severe, but we've stabilized them with internal fixation, titanium rods and screws. There was some soft tissue damage that we've repaired as well. He's going to need significant rehabilitation, but barring complications, he should regain normal function in time. When can we see him? Linda asked. He'll be moved to a room. Shortly. Once he's settled, you can have a brief visit, but he'll be groggy from the anesthesia. Tomorrow would be better for a longer conversation. Linda thanked the doctor, then turned to the crew. You all should go home, get some rest. You've had a long day. I'll stay with him tonight. The men exchanged glances, reluctant to leave, but recognizing the wisdom in her words. They had been awake since before dawn, had experienced a traumatic event, and still had responsibilities to attend to in the morning. We'll be back tomorrow, Mike promised, and don't worry about anything at home. We'll take care of whatever you need. They prepared to leave. A new figure approached, a man in a navy blue uniform with Coast Guard insignia. Captain Reeves? He inquired, looking at Mike. Mike nodded, extending his hand. That's me. Lieutenant Commander Wilson, U.S. Coast Guard Marine Safety Office. I understand one of your crew was involved in a shark incident today. I was hoping to get some details for our report. Mike sighed, fatigue evident in his posture. Can this wait until morning, Commander? We've been going since 4 a.m. and it's been a hell of a day. The officer seemed to consider this before nodding. Of course, I apologize for the timing. Would tomorrow afternoon work, say 2 p.m. at your vessel? We'll need statements from all witnesses and some photographs of any damage to the vessel. We'll be there, Mike confirmed, though there's no damage to the boat. The shark bumped it once, but that's all. The officer made a note. Still, it helps us build our incident database. These events are rare, but understanding them helps us develop better safety protocols. He handed Mike a card. Call if you have any questions, and I'm glad your crewman is going to be okay. After the Coast Guard officer departed, the crew said their goodbyes to Linda, promising to return the following day. They left the hospital in silence, the events of the day weighing heavily on them. In the days that followed, Steve's story became minor local news. A reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle interviewed the crew and published a short article on page 3 of the Metro section. Local fisherman survives shark encounter at Farallones. A few smaller outlets picked up the story, but within a week, public interest had waned, the incident becoming just another entry in the long history of man's encounters with the ocean's predators. The Coast Guard investigation was similarly brief. The crew provided their statements, the incident was documented, and a notation was added to navigational charts and maritime safety bulletins, reminding vessels in the area of shark activity near the Farallon Islands, information that was already well known to local mariners. For Steve Walsh, however, the encounter marked a profound change. His recovery progressed as the doctors had predicted, but it was neither quick nor easy. The fractures healed slowly, and physical therapy was a grueling process of regaining strength and mobility in his damaged leg. The medical bills mounted, partially covered by the boat's insurance, but still imposing a financial strain on his family. 3 months after the incident, Steve returned to the waterfront, walking with a pronounced limp and using a cane. He couldn't yet resume his duties aboard the Northern Star, but he came to help with the dockside work, mending nets, maintaining equipment, handling the administrative tasks that Mike had always hated. The psychological recovery proved as challenging as the physical. Steve experienced nightmares, waking in cold sweats with the image of that massive grey form surging toward him burned into his mind. He found himself scanning the water whenever he was near it, his heart racing at any unusual movement beneath the surface. Linda suggested counseling, but Steve resisted, insisting he would work through it in his own time. What troubled him most, perhaps, was the lack of resolution. The shark that had attacked him remained out there, continuing its existence as nature intended, unaware of the impact it had had on his life. Unlike human assailants who might be caught and punished, providing some sense of justice or closure, this wild predator had simply followed its instincts, neither malicious nor merciful. Scientists from the Farallon Islands Research Group had shown interest in his case, asking detailed questions about the shark's size, behavior, and distinguishing marks. When Steve mentioned the notched dorsal fin, they had exchanged significant glances. They showed him photographs of known individuals in their catalogue, and he identified SF-37 as closely resembling his attacker. The researchers explained that she was a known resident of the sanctuary, with no previous human interactions recorded. This information provided Steve with a strange comfort. Putting a designation to the animal somehow made it less of a random force of nature and more of a specific entity he had encountered. 6 months after the attack, Steve returned to the ESA Northern Star on a limited basis, still not fully healed but unwilling to remain ashore any longer. The crew welcomed him back with gruff affection, having kept his position open despite the hardship of working short-handed during his absence. His first day back at sea was tense, especially as they approached the fishing grounds near the Farallones. Steve found himself scanning the water constantly, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. But the familiar rhythm of the work gradually asserted itself, and by the end of the day, some of the tension had eased from his shoulders. As weeks turned into months, Steve adapted to his new reality. His leg would never be the same. Weather changes brought aching pain, and long days on his feet resulted in swelling and stiffness. He learned to compensate, to distribute his weight differently, to use the boat's structure for support when needed. The nightmares became less frequent, though they never disappeared entirely. A year after the incident, on a rare day off, Steve took his 14-year-old son, Jason, to the California Academy of Sciences in Golden Gate Park. Among its many exhibits was one dedicated to the marine life of the Farallon Islands, including a section on its great white sharks. Steve stood before a life-sized model of a 16-foot great white, his son beside him, both silent as they contemplated the massive predator suspended from the ceiling. "Is that what got you, Dad?" Jason finally asked, his voice hushed in the quiet exhibit hall. Steve studied the model, noting the perfectly streamlined body, the cold black eye, the rows of triangular teeth visible in the slightly opened mouth. "Something like it," he replied. "Maybe even this exact one they modeled it after. The researchers said the population isn't that large." Jason looked from the shark to his father's scarred leg, visible below his shorts. "Weren't you scared?" Steve considered the question carefully. "Terrified," he admitted. "But you know what I realized afterward? It wasn't hunting me. It was just curious, checking out something unusual in its territory. We happened to be in the wrong place at exactly the wrong time." "Do you hate it?" "The shark?" Steve shook his head slowly. "Can't hate something for being what it is. Those waters were shark territory long before they were fishing grounds. We're the visitors there, not them." As they moved through the exhibit, Steve found himself drawn to a display about shark conservation. He read about declining global shark populations, the impact of fishing practices, the slow reproductive rate that made sharks vulnerable to extinction. It struck him as ironic. He had every reason to fear and resent these creatures, yet here he was feeling concern for their future. That evening, as the sun set over the Pacific, Steve stood on the dock beside the Northern Star, preparing for their departure the next morning. The western sky blazed orange and purple, reflecting on the harbor waters. In the distance, beyond the Golden Gate, lay the open ocean and, farther still, the rugged silhouettes of the Farallon Islands. Somewhere in those waters, SF-37 continued her solitary existence, patrolling her territory, hunting seals, occasionally encountering other great whites. During the mating season, she would never know how significantly one brief moment of her long life had altered the course of Steve's, how the split-second decision to investigate a strange disturbance had left permanent marks on both his body and mind. Steve absently rubbed his leg, feeling the raised scars beneath his pants and the metal hardware that now held his bones together. The physical pain had diminished over time, but the memory remained vivid. The sudden impact, the desperate struggle to get out of the water, the long recovery afterward. Yet mixed with the trauma was a newfound respect for the ocean and its inhabitants, a deeper understanding of his place in its vast ecosystem. He had returned to the sea as he had always known he would. The fishing life was the only one he had ever wanted, the only one he knew how to live. But he returned with a heightened awareness, a profound respect for the fine line between man's domain and the wild. Each time the Northern Star ventured out toward the Farallones, he felt the shadow of that encounter, not as paralyzing fear but as a reminder of his vulnerability in the face of nature's raw power. The last light faded from the sky, stars emerging in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring another day at sea, another chance to cast their nets into the mysterious depths. Steve turned away from the water and headed home, carrying with him the invisible weight of his encounter, the scars, the memories, and the strange, reluctant bond he now shared with a predator he had glimpsed for only moments but would remember for the rest of his life.